LLSP alumni and alumni. Assalamu alaikum and welcome to the April 21 Lunch and Learn interview. As it happens, today is Earth Day, and so I thought it would be appropriate to focus on issues at the intersections of environment, law, social justice, sustainable development, and Muslim values. I could not be more excited to be interviewing our own Ambereen Shaffie Esquire, LLSP class of 2015. Ms. Shaffie has had a distinguished career at the intersection of environmental law and policy, both in the US and internationally. She holds a BA in Economics and International Studies from the University of Kansas. After taking some time off for work and additional academic studies, Ms. Shaffie received her JD, also from the University of Kansas, following which she obtained an LLM in International and Comparative Law from the American University in Cairo during her Rotary Ambassadorial Fellowship year. Ms. Shaffie is the founder and managing partner of Shaffie Law and Policy, located in Washington, D.C., which provides legal representation and case strategy on environmental and civil matters in the US, as well as policy advice and strategy to institutions worldwide. Whew. And that's just the short version. Thank you so much, Ambereen, for agreeing to let me interview you today. I realize that there is so much to discuss and our time is limited. So could you please take a few minutes to sketch out the context of the environmental mess we find ourselves in today?
Well, first, wa alaikum salam to everybody who's watching and to you as well. Yasara, I really appreciate KARAMAH giving me the opportunity to talk about these issues, which I'm so passionate about, but also maybe don't get highlighted as much on Muslim platforms. So I'm really grateful for that opportunity on this historic Earth Day. So there are many environmental issues that together form the context for what we call the climate crisis. We shifted from calling it climate change to climate crisis. And the framework for everything I talk about today is going to be in terms of broad scientific consensus. That's the proper lens through which to view any environmental issue. So that's really important because we live in an age of misinformation. So we like to talk about the broad scientific consensus rather than get into sort of mini arguments. So I also want folks to keep in mind that environmental problems do not develop in a linear way. Rather, they're the result of tipping points or feedback loops. So a combination of one or more factors leads to a cyclical process that triggers further negative impacts. So one example is global warming melts polar ice caps, which in turn exposes darker land mass. That darker land mass absorbs more solar heat, which triggers more warming and further melting of the ice caps. So you can see that there's kind of a cyclical nature to these things. And that's important because we are on track right now to trip these tipping points that once they are triggered will create irreversible damage to the earth. So if we allow I'm sure everybody listening has heard of the Paris Agreement. So the Paris Agreement set this goal to limit average global temperature below 2 degrees Celsius. If we go beyond that, things like pandemics, droughts, floods, fires, the destruction of natural resources will be unmanageable. And so how much time do we have? That's what a lot of folks talk about in terms of anxiety around the environment. So again, the broad scientific consensus at this time is that we have less than 10 years to meet our goals, to mitigate greenhouse gas and carbon emissions to a sustainable level, which really means the level at which we need to sustain human life. Whether the world is ready to act within these 10 years is actually unknown. The Paris Agreement goals were set up along with other environmental treaties, which I'll talk about later. What we do know is that we can't do this a lot by reducing carbon dioxide alone. We also have to target short-lived climate pollutants. So what I'm saying is that there's multiple strategies that have to be used. We have less than 10 years. And the broad scientific consensus is really what people should use as their guide when they're thinking about and tackling these issues. So,
it seems to me that one of the problems, of course, is that climate is a complex system, and any one thing may have unforeseen knock-on effects. One that I'm very much aware of living here in Guernsey is worries about the Gulf Stream slowing down and possibly stopping, and so not getting the transfer of heat into the northern latitudes of the United Kingdom could lead to other unforeseen problems. It's really quite a mess. Oh, well, thank you for giving us the context and setting the frame for our conversation. As an enthusiastic gardener, I've been aware for decades that winters are getting shorter and warmer and summers longer and hotter, and that this is reflected in early flowering of plants and deleterious effects on pollinators and other bugs in general. It seems impossible to open a newspaper today without reading at least one lengthy article about our changing environment, policy debates about what we can do about it and how, and insights into the linkages between a changing environment and issues like disease, war, refugees, water, health equity, perhaps I should say health inequity, yes, as well as a host of other problems, all of which are linked to a changing environment. I doubt we'll have to get time to get into all of it, but I would like to start by asking you to share with us your own journey as a Muslim, or to put it more generally, what do you believe is our relationship as Muslims towards this world which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created for us?
That's a great question. So I see the destruction of earth and the destruction of women as fundamentally linked. This is the lens that I use. So God says in the Holy Quran that all Muslims, every walk of life, that in Surah Al-Talaq, that he created the world so that he would be known to us. And, specifically it says it is Allah who's created the seven heavens and the earth. His commandments are sent between them so that you would know that God has power over all things, and that God's knowledge encompasses all. So this tells me that we can know God by knowing his creations. So there are many verses in the Quran that refer to the beautiful aspects of earth and nature, the fruit-bearing trees and the sky and the mountains and water, and the sacred life of all of God's creatures, even if they're as tiny as an ant. In doing so, God is inviting us to see and to witness that every living thing is worthy of dignity and divine treatment. So the satisfying and motivating factor for me in my work is the spiritual alignment I feel with that concept. So the Prophet, peace be upon him, in his last sermon, chose to focus on and deliver the warning that women have rights and that men must take care of women, that they are under Allah's trust, and that we must treat them with kindness. So as I study the Quran, as I study the development of history of Muslims throughout the world, I point to the significance of this being in the last sermon, as a warning against the mistreatment of women that God knew would come. So today you often see people linking the objectification and destruction of the earth with the objectification and destruction of women as the root of every ill that you see. And so to treat either well requires a maturation of one's relationship with the earth and with women. That which gives us life is the most revered thing to Allah, so much so that he extends his divine protection to them and commands us to do so as well. So this, in my opinion, is the ultimate advocacy. To be worthy of following God's command, we have to take care of women and the earth, and to cherish both as the source of life. And we all know we've heard many times that the word rahma is, the root of that word is womb. And so the root of the word of one of Allah's most revered and interesting names has to do with a connection to giving life. So everything you see and feel and hear today is living because it is given existence by the giver of life. That's another name for Allah, Al-Muhyi, if I'm saying that right.
Yep.
And everything that is comes from life itself. And that's another name for Allah, al-Hayy. And so the month of Ramadan is really here. It's meant to help us see that. So that's really where I see women and the earth as a source of life and an extension of the divine, which is the source of that creation.
I'm reminded of a story my father used to tell me about a Bedou who came to the Prophet ﷺ and said, whom should I, honor in this world after God and his Prophet? And the Prophet said, your mother. And the Bedou said, and then after her, whom? And he said, your mother. And the Bedou said, yes, but after her, whom? And the Prophet said for a third time, your mother. And finally the Bedou said, all right, but after my mother, whom should I honor? And he said, your father. And my own father used to tell me that, usually when I'd been rude to my own mother when I was a teenager, which, as we know, is a difficult period for mothers and daughters generally. So I find this way of looking at your relationship to the natural world and the importance of the creative power of the world and the God and of women sort of all together. It's just very inspiring. Alhamdulillah. Well, anyway, thank you for this very eloquent articulation of your personal journey. But could you now also tell us to what extent you see a political paradigm in the Quran that could lead us to take action to protect our environment?
And thank you for reflecting on my points about my personal journey. I'm going to circle back to that when we talk a little bit later. But shifting now to discussing kind of the political paradigm. So I just authored a book chapter on health and climate and looking at the health impacts of climate change and how to sort of look at those issues and solve those issues. And so the book is coming out later this month. And one of the things that I say in that chapter, which is, I don't know how well received it will be, but what I say is economic growth has never, ever, ever been decoupled from continuous carbon emissions. In other words, we have not figured out a model to grow, to develop, to industrialize, all of these things, to advance without emitting more carbon. Mm-hmm. And as a theoretical concept, that's a confrontational idea, mm-hmm. because that's not something that I think many governments or institutions, banking institutions, corporate institutions are going to want to talk about, because mm-hmm. it strikes at the heart of a paradigm shift. What it means is you would need to consume differently and consume less and rely on community resources and a different model of living. And that's going to change profit margins for a lot of people if mm-hmm. we were to make that shift. So there's a Native American term for this called wetiko. And I'm sure I'm not pronouncing that right. So if there's native speakers listening, please correct me, but it's an Algonquin word, and it means excessive greed and consumption and a disregard for the dignity of life. And this is fundamentally opposed. It's diametrically opposed to Islam, which is fundamentally life-affirming and life-giving. And it's a different philosophy through the lens of capitalism as we are practicing it. The way we're practicing development, capitalism, and industrialization is extraction. Extract the maximum resources and squeeze every last drop, and then invent new ways to extract it at a faster rate or a different rate.
And push the consequences down the line so someone else can pay for it, so that you don't have to deal with the mess you've left behind you.
And I think also there's a techno-optimism. If you look up that term, techno-optimism is the idea that technology can solve everything and that technology will save us from from humanity's greatest ills, without thinking about what you're saying. So I don't even know if it's pushing the consequences. I think sometimes those consequences are disregarded. And so this is different than the Islamic philosophy that basically humans are here to exist in symbiosis and in service to another purpose. And, there's another philosophy out there that's radically leftist, which is humans are a virus on the earth and the two cannot exist in symbiosis. Again, we look at Islam from the view of life-giving and life-affirming. And to do that, it's much more complex than saying humans must go, they can't coexist. And that coexistence then requires this idea of a paradigm shift, that you can't maybe have the huge house and the several cars and the big lifestyle that, you know, you have been born and bred to admire prior generations for. And I speak about modern generations. If you go into native cultures and indigenous cultures in many of the Muslim countries that we originate from, and even, you know, native and indigenous cultures here, certainly in the Americas, their view was not that, excuse me, that development and human development and community development had to be coupled with destruction. Their idea was very much about renewal and conservation and living with nature rather than dominating nature. So this is the paradigm we're in right now, though, the dominant paradigm. Now, are we willing to learn and take lessons from, and maybe take a back seat to indigenous practices or a paradigm shift? I don't know the answer to that. I know that there are some Muslims who, for example, started a farm where folks can go and sort of live in more harmony with the earth and sort of use that as a tool for spiritual development. But it's I think most of them go there temporarily and then go back to their modern lives. And I'm not suggesting anybody's living their life in the wrong way. I'm saying this is a big idea that we're talking about, a paradigm shift from the dominant one that we live in.
Yes, I have in recent years become more and more attracted to it's not really a new idea, but the idea of the circular economy. So it's less about more and more. So it's less about, well, in a way, unconfined growth is essentially a cancer. Okay. Whereas growth, which is moderate and within what the environment can stand. In other words, the circular economy, one that takes into account everyone's needs and does, remediation as at the same time. So you're taking and you're giving. It's not all take, and, But you're right. It's really important. We need to think about these things.
Yeah, I'm so glad you used the word circular economy. This is a word that I want every one of our listeners to Google and think about, because so today is the World Leaders Climate Summit, or Leaders Climate Summit. And President Biden arranged for the leaders of multiple large countries to come and speak today. The IMF, the World Bank, the Green Climate Fund, Global Environment Facility, everybody is really on this call today, or virtual conference today, to talk about their climate commitments. And they're announcing huge, billions, and I think even some cases, when it is all added up, will be trillions of dollars of commitment to climate action, what we call mitigation and adaptation. And one of the things that Chile brought up today was being a commitment to circular economy. And I thought it was so fascinating because it's not something that comes up that much in mainstream high level remarks of heads of state. And the fact that it is, and he also said that we need to live in harmony with nature and learn from nature. Mm-hmm. And so this idea of biomimicry, or giving nature sort of a seat at the table and learning from the existing systems of nature, the ecosystems themselves, what lessons they have to teach us, that is becoming mainstream. That's a huge, so I had to highlight when you said that, because that was sort of something maybe not as discussed on such a scale that it is now.
Well, and high time, is all I can say.
Great.
Well, what you've just shared with us is leaving me feeling a little bit helpless and overwhelmed, although it is good news that they're now talking about spending billions and trillions of dollars. We just hope they do it in the right way. But given the realities and challenges of the environmental catastrophe that's looming over us all, can you give us some suggestions about real practical things that we can do to create the positive changes we need? After all, and this is just my opinion, we have a duty to act and to cultivate the hope that if we do the right thing, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will guide us and make us successful.
I mean, absolutely, we have a duty to do that because we are life-giving and life-affirming. Our views do not align, at least in my humble opinion. Our views, I don't see anything in the Quran or the study of Islam that aligns with the idea that humans are a virus and the earth won't regenerate until we're wiped out, or, we can only do what we can do and this is inevitable. We don't have that sense of nihilism at least in my view, in our religion. So this is our duty to act. And I love this part of the discussion because we always get here to this point where people feel overwhelmed and sort of depressed. And I always have a list of 3 to 4 things that I want to talk about. So the first thing is empowering women. I told you I would circle back to this. I promised you I would, and I am. So there is a project called Project Drawdown. It's actually based on a book. And in the original text, a group of people from broad, stakeholder backgrounds. So there were scientists, there were policymakers, there were advocates and civil society leaders, all kinds of people from every single background weighed in on the top 100 solutions to reduce carbon emissions. And so Project Drawdown really used this very pedestrian mathematical formula to quantify the carbon emissions that would be saved from each of these 100 solutions. And they ranked them 1 to 100. And then, we focus on the top 10 solutions a lot of times when we're talking because they save the greatest amount of emissions. So if you look at the top 10 solutions, the number 1 solution there is refrigeration management. This is not something normally people would think about. So the reason it is refrigeration management is because global warming. The earth is getting hotter, summers are getting longer and hotter, peak heat times are higher than before, and the middle class is rising, which is causing them to purchase more air conditioners. So
yes, and cities are huge, enormous heat sinks because we've designed them with, without thinking about natural ways to lower the heat.
Right. So, I embarked on this journey to help countries, help educate them about signing on to the Kigali Amendment to the Montreal Protocol. The Montreal Protocol is an environmental treaty that was signed in 1980 to limit the emissions of ozone depleting substances. So there was a giant hole in the ozone in the 70s, and 2 Nobel Prize winning chemists figured out that short-lived climate pollutants were actually hundreds and sometimes even thousands of times more potent than carbon dioxide, and that they had burned this huge hole in the ozone. And so they signed onto the Montreal Protocol because short-lived climate pollutants, they stay in the atmosphere much shorter, maybe 10 to 15 years, as opposed to carbon dioxide, which is like 500. Yeah. And they are also more potent. So when you cut emissions of short-lived climate pollutants, it's like slamming the brake on climate change. It's like slamming the brake on it because you see the effect immediately. Mm-hmm. And so what happened was 100% of countries signed on and complied with the Montreal Protocol back in 1980 and started their commitment to phase out what then was called chlorofluorocarbons. So if you remember in the 70s and 80s, people banning spray cans and aerosol spray cans because they were made with CFCs, this short-lived climate pollutant. And what happened was they were able to completely reverse the effects and heal the ozone layer. So
I'm old enough to remember that. I mean, it's real for me. It's not ancient history. It's my life. I remember that.
Of course. And so, what happened was, so the Montreal Protocol is the most successful example of international cooperation in the history of international law, in the history of environmental law, in the history. So it's really this beacon of global cooperation and what we can achieve when we work together with scientists and policymakers and industry players and civil society. All of them were a part of that. So a few years ago, colleagues and I were talking about ratifying the Kigali Amendment the Montreal Protocol, to add an amendment that would ban hydrofluorocarbons. So it's another fluorinated gas that is a a huge contributor to greenhouse gas emissions. And it's also a short-lived climate pollutant. So there were many years of negotiations, and what was wonderful is that during the negotiations, I had a chance to participate not only in the adoption of the Paris Agreement, but the adoption of the Kigali Amendment as well. Why is the Kigali Amendment important? Because it bans hydrofluorocarbons, which are primarily used in refrigerants, cooling equipment, some insulating foams, but primarily cooling equipment like refrigerators. So if we successfully implement the Kigali Amendment, we can remove 0.5 degrees Celsius of warming from the Earth's atmosphere. So think about Paris, the Paris goals being to reduce it to below 2 degrees. You get, almost all the way to halfway to meet your goals. Furthermore, if you combine it with energy efficiency, with increasing the energy efficiency of the equipment, you double the benefits of either strategy alone. So then you can take out 1 full degree of warming from the Earth's atmosphere with one treaty and one
it sounds like relatively quickly, because these are short-lived,
very quickly
chemicals. Yeah,
very quickly. It's one of our biggest steps in achieving the Paris climate goals, because
but that would require regulatory intervention. Then this is not something individuals can do on their own.
No, I think, but I'm bringing it back to sort of our individual actions. I wanted to explain the context first. So scientists predict that right now we are on track to achieve 4 degrees of warming. Ooh. That's really far from 2 degrees. We've got to get there. And the Kigali Amendment is one of the most effective tools to do so. Right now, many countries have ratified the Kigali Amendment. China just announced that it ratified, maybe I would say like a week ago. The United States has not yet ratified the Kigali Amendment. One of the biggest actions individuals can take in the United States is to write to their senators, write to their representatives, and urge the US to ratify and implement the Kigali Amendment right now. And it may not seem like it's not the sexiest issue, it's not the most obvious issue, but it is the #1 solution to mitigating carbon in Project Drawdown, to reducing global warming. And so I encourage people to look at that, look at Project Drawdown and the top 10 solutions. So moving down that list, 2 of those solutions deal with empowering women: educating girls and women, and family planning. When you add up the gigatons of carbon saved from those 2 strategies, you outweigh the #1 solution. So when I spoke earlier about how I see why I see the importance of empowering women as directly aligned with environmental goals, I'm not just talking about philosophically or in terms of the religion and the spirituality and the commandment. I'm talking about the actual numbers that we need to get to achieve our goals to sustain life on Earth. It's not a coincidence that women are so central. They're often early adopters of climate technologies, and then they end up teaching the village and teaching their children, a woman is a school. We've heard that phrase. So they have a multiplying effect when they are brought into the climate solutions. They're the key to implementing those solutions. And they're often the innovators. They're often the ones who come up with ideas, because women are in charge often of managing the resources in the household. So I think it's when it comes to family planning, I want to make this comment that women are humanity's greatest resource. We talk a lot about oil, and we talk a lot about natural resources being beneficial, or nuclear energy, or things like that, renewable energy. Women are the greatest resource for their families. And what I'm really saying is women are men's greatest resource. And so to the extent that we talk about in Karama and about patriarchy extracting from women and treating them as a resource to be used up, I want to point out that there's a very key lesson here that I think is our struggle right now, to really understand how to respect and elevate women to the point of, just from a very practical standpoint, what we need to do in order to tackle the climate crisis. So empowering women, write to your representative about ratifying the Kigali Amendment. And the third thing, which is I think pretty obvious to people, is eating less meat. I'm not suggesting you have to eliminate meat. I'm not suggesting that I know anybody's dietary needs or restrictions, but eating less meat will reduce your carbon footprint almost immediately. It will have an impact. There are lots of individual actions that don't have as much of an impact as this. So I like to think in terms of what's the biggest bang for my buck? What is the least amount I can do and have the greatest impact? These are three things that, well, except for empowering women, I think, that are fairly easy to do and don't take a lot of time. So these are effective personal choices and lifestyle changes that have a huge political impact. And I can definitely share more resources on how to do that and look at each of those solutions in more detail.
Well, and eating meatless, most of us come from cultures where fortunately there are lots of meatless options that are absolutely delicious. I can list any number of them just right off the top, but it shouldn't be considered a big sacrifice to go meatless a few days of the week. So anyway,
I always tell people, just try it. Just try one meal out of the week and see how you feel. Try and, experiment with it, and see if that, what suits your cooking style and what starts to open your mind, because I'm always mindful that pushing people never really works. Teaching them and sort of leading them in a gentler way when it comes to environmental action is I found more success with that.
Well, but meatless is fun, much more interesting, if I do say so myself.
I think it's fun. I think it's something that Muslim organizations can maybe start to promote. Maybe a meatless iftar, maybe just one for the whole month. I'm not asking for too much, or maybe highlighting how they're serving meatless at a particular fundraiser or function and why they're doing it. I think mosques are slowly becoming more aware of this issue, but I think that is kind of a way to show people that the idea is becoming more mainstream.
Rahma, if you're listening, I know I'm making a joke, but maybe Karama should think about sponsoring a meatless iftar this Ramadan, because there's no time like the present to change your behavior. So there is something I did want you to expand on a little bit, Ambereen, before you go, and that is the link between environmental degradation and the human toll in terms of climate refugees, in terms of how low-lying areas, many Muslim countries lie pretty close to the current sea level and are already experiencing problems with saltwater encroachment, into their aquifers and the inability to farm and so on and so forth. But if you could just sort of give us an overview on where things are likely to go in that realm if we don't take the business of trying to move in the better direction seriously.
Well, I think it's very true. So extreme weather, when you look at the climate indicators, 75% of the global population will be exposed to deadly heat stress, and millions of people will be affected by flood and famine within the next 10 years. Recently floods in South Asia had displaced about 41 million people and killed thousands, about 40% of which were children. They had the highest floods on records in 40 years. South Asia has also had the highest heat indexes. They were literally, I think in India, digging mass graves because they just couldn't accommodate the amount of people who were dying from heat exposure. And of course, that contributes to heart disease and high blood pressure, which is a secondary way of explaining how climate has a downstream. It has this sort of trickle down effect. And the other thing that the climate crisis is doing, it's destroying crops and homes. All of the way, whenever you look at resources shrinking or life becoming unsustainable, that's going to create climate refugees. And climate science tells us we're going to have more extreme events, more floods and droughts, wildfires and hurricanes in the future. So you see only rising deaths and disease from it. You don't see those being mitigated. I think 250,000 additional climate-related deaths per year are expected between 2030 and 2050 from things like malnutrition, malaria, diarrhea, and heat stress, all of which are directly exacerbated by climate change. So, I have a very old statistic about 24 million people in 118 countries being displaced by natural disasters. That was back in 2016. If I were to update that, I'm sure the number would be much larger. And 3 times as many were displaced by conflict. And where is conflict coming from? Conflict is coming from the domination and fight over natural resources. So let's not forget the Syrian drought between 2006 to 2009 that directly contributed to ISIS. I think when you look at global, there are lots of global groups that are actually dedicated to the linking between climate change and national security, and it's a big topic today at the Climate Leaders Summit. So there's a global military alliance on climate change that puts out all kinds of research about security and how food security and international and national security are impacted by these types of things. So whenever you have a weakened population that has fewer resources, these actors like ISIS or people who can now, forces that can take over those resources and dominate them and distribute them in an inequitable way or control them, they control people. And you're going to have situations where vulnerable populations are exploited. That is fundamentally the heart of what I'm going to focus on when it comes to climate refugees. So we're going to see more events that create more climate refugees, but we're also going to see more bad actors who are going to take advantage of that and exploit those vulnerabilities. So we have a responsibility to think about this in terms of preserving human life. And from a national security standpoint, like I said, the global military advisors, they have already spoken in such clear terms about how climate change creates a threat to their forces, to their security forces, and to national borders. So, to the extent that we don't want immigration and, we really need to protect our borders. I mean, sort of if you come from that securitized lens, one of the first things you should be dealing with is climate change. To the extent that you want to help people feel secure and safe in their home, which I think is a human right, then we have to think about mitigating the climate crisis, because the pandemic, highlighted health inequities and just inequities in general. It was a privilege if you could quarantine and work from home. Indeed. If you were a blue collar worker, you were a person of color, or people in poor countries who frankly don't even have access to the vaccine right as we speak, you were not in a position to really deal with the pandemic. You were just at risk. You didn't have PPE. You didn't have the type of masks and protections that people who are privileged do, just to be able to distance and not, when you're not living in a crowded, sort of situation. So the pandemic is really just the first sign that where it touched everybody's life, even in privileged circles, and helped them realize, listen, this is what the earth is telling us. This is what our Quran is telling us. This is what our literature is telling us. We are all interconnected. You cannot create a refugee from Mexico and think it's not going to affect you in your suburb in Virginia. It is going to affect you. It is affecting you right now. And the refugee is running from a problem that's going to impact the food prices in the grocery stores you shop in. Or the refugee is running from something that is spilling over rapidly into every area of our life. And all of those things exacerbate disease vectors. So this pandemic is just a trial run. And frankly, I don't think we did that well. But we're going to have many more pandemics. This is what a lot of the book that I have coming out later this month, where I author one of the chapters, a lot of my co-authors are talking about the exacerbation of disease vectors and pandemics, and how much more often we're going to see that, because human movement is just, people are in turmoil and have to change their living situation rapidly, and naturally they're bringing different different types of bacteria, different types of, their systems are not accustomed to our systems, and all of those things are colliding right now. So climate refugees is a big issue, and I can talk about it for a long time, but I think the main thing you need to think about is it created ISIS. It created the pandemic. It's going to create more and more problems unless we take it more seriously.
It's also unethical and immoral not to address these issues, and I feel very strongly about that. It's not, it's not just maslaha. It's also very important that we take this problem seriously. Anyway, that's just me getting on my soapbox. Well, this has been a fascinating, if scary, conversation. I know you've done a workshop for KARAMAH before on these issues, so perhaps we can arrange for you, or twist your arm and make you come and do another workshop for us later in 2021. But for now, I just want to thank you most sincerely for making the time to talk to us and to scare us today.
Well, I hope I created some hope. There's a lot of hope, and there are a lot of things that we can do on an individual level to remain. I don't want people to feel helpless. I think that's the message that other people send sometimes when talking about climate. That's the one thing that I feel very secure in, that Islam has given us a path forward. Even on the Day of Judgment, it says plant a tree. And so that we will have, inshallah, barakah for everything that we do, but also you will have an impact if you take action.
Ameen, Ya Rabb. Ameen. Whew. And now for a few quick plugs. Speaking of hope, looking forward, our speaker for our 27th of May 2021 Lunch and Learn will be Juwaria Khan, who is the founder and executive director of the Appellate Project. The mission of the Appellate Project is to empower law students of color to thrive in the appellate field, and hopefully also move into the judiciary in due course, says I. Also, the application period for KARAMAH's 2021 Virtual Law and Leadership Program will start on May 3rd. Participation is open to both men and women. Thank you, Zoom. Please start talking it up among your friends and family and encourage them to apply. By taking this program virtual in 2020, we were able to double the number of participants we've normally been able to reach, while also cutting the cost. With your help, we're hoping to meet or exceed our 2020 numbers this year, inshallah. And I'll take this opportunity to wish everybody Ramadan Mubarak.
Ramadan Mubarak. And as a former alum of LLSP and instructor, I'm going to plug that as well. It's a life-changing experience, and everyone who's listening, I hope you apply.
You heard it from her. Goodbye, everybody. Thank you so much.
Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah.